The penthouse elevator dinged softly as its doors slid open, revealing Cassie Bennett kneeling on the floor, her hands working fast to untangle the leash of a golden retriever who had somehow managed to wrap itself around her legs. The dog barked happily, oblivious to her exasperation. "Come on, Max, work with me here," Cassie muttered, freeing herself from the leash just as another voice rang out. "Max!" Cassie's head shot up, heart sinking as she met the piercing gray eyes of her employer, Alexander Pierce, one of New York's most powerful and enigmatic billionaires. His tailored suit looked more expensive than her yearly rent, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Max, however, had no respect for power or polish. He immediately lunged toward Alexander, leaving Cassie scrambling to hold onto the leash. "Mr. Pierce," Cassie gasped. "I'm so sorry. Alexander raised a hand, silencing her apology as he crouched to ruffle Max's fur. No harm done. It was the first time Cassie had ever seen him smile, a fleeting moment before his usual unreadable expression returned. She had been working as his dog walker for 6 months now, but this was the closest she'd come to having an actual conversation with him. "I need you to come with me tonight," Alexander said, standing and fixing her with a steady gaze. Cassie blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "To dinner. Business. Tonight." Her mind raced. Dinner? Business? What could he possibly need her for? "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Mr. Pierce. I'm not exactly—" She gestured vaguely at herself. Her scuffed sneakers, oversized sweater, and jeans still damp from Max's overzealous play in the park. "Dinner ready." Alexander's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen before tucking it back into his pocket. "Be ready at 8. Formal attire." "Wait!" she called after him, but he was already walking away, Max trotting happily behind him. That evening Cassie stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, still reeling from the events of the day. Her apartment was tiny, barely more than a studio with a perpetually dripping faucet, but tonight it felt even smaller. "What am I doing?" she muttered to herself as she adjusted the hem of her black cocktail dress. It wasn't hers, of course. She'd borrowed it from her neighbor, Gia, who swore it was business chic enough to pass muster. Cassie had paired it with simple heels and a thrifted clutch. She didn't own jewelry fancy enough to wear, so her neck and wrists were bare. When Alexander's town car arrived, she was half tempted to stay hidden in her apartment. But the memory of his no-nonsense tone, and the unspoken promise of being fired if she refused, forced her to gather her courage and step outside. The car ride was silent, save for the faint hum of the engine. Alexander didn't acknowledge her beyond a brief nod, his focus glued to his phone. When they arrived at the restaurant, Cassie's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was the restaurant, a Michelin-starred establishment that she'd only ever read about. As they stepped inside, heads turned. The maitre d' practically tripped over himself to greet Alexander, leading them to a private room at the back. The dinner begins. Cassie felt entirely out of place among the polished executives who greeted Alexander like an old friend. They didn't spare her more than a passing glance, clearly dismissing her as someone unimportant. That changed when Alexander introduced her. "This is Cassandra Bennett," he said, his voice carrying an edge of finality that dared anyone to question him. "My guest this evening." Cassie's stomach twisted at the weight of their stares, but she managed a polite smile. She spent the first course nodding and murmuring in response to polite small talk, all the while wishing she could disappear into the floor. But things took a turn when the waiter served the main course. Cassie had been cutting into her filet mignon when she noticed something strange. One of the executives, a man named Peter Wexler, was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Do I know you?" he asked suddenly, his tone dripping with suspicion. Cassie froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "I don't think so." But Peter's gaze didn't waver. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "No, I'm certain I've seen you before." Alexander's sharp tone cut through the tension. "Peter, if you're done interrogating my guest, perhaps we can return to discussing the merger." Peter held up his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes never left Cassie. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of stiff conversation and veiled tension. By the time the dessert was served, Cassie was ready to flee. But just as she thought the night was over, Alexander leaned toward her. "We're going somewhere else," he said quietly. Cassie didn't have time to argue before he was on his feet, leading her out of the restaurant and into the waiting town car. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice shaky. Alexander's response was as enigmatic as ever. "You'll see." The reveal they drove for nearly 20 minutes, leaving the glittering city lights behind. The car pulled up to a secluded mansion that loomed against the night sky like something out of a Gothic novel. Cassie hesitated at the door. "Why are we here?" Alexander stepped inside without waiting for her, calling over his shoulder, "Follow me." Against her better judgment, Cassie did. The interior of the mansion was even more imposing than the outside. Dark wood paneling, antique chandeliers, and an unsettling stillness that made her feel as though they were being watched. Alexander led her to a study, where he closed the door and turned to face her. "I need to know something," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Cassie swallowed hard. "What? Who are you, really?" The question hit her like a freight train. "Excuse me?" Alexander's gray eyes bored into hers. "Peter wasn't wrong. He recognized you, and so did I." Cassie's blood ran cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." Alexander's jaw tightened. He reached for a drawer in the desk, pulling out a photograph. He placed it on the desk in front of her. Cassie's heart stopped when she saw it. It was her. The photo showed her standing on a street corner, speaking with a man she recognized immediately. Vincent Moretti, a known criminal and one of the most dangerous men in the city. "I don't know what game you're playing," Alexander said, his tone like ice. "But you're going to tell me exactly how you know Moretti, and why you're really here." Cassie stared at the photograph, her mind racing. She knew she was innocent, but how could she convince Alexander of that? The room seemed to close in around her as she realized one terrifying truth. Tonight wasn't about business or dinner. It was a test, and she had no idea if she would pass. Cassie's breath hitched as she stared at the photo, her mind spinning with panic. It was unmistakably her, caught mid-conversation with Vincent Moretti, the city's most notorious and elusive crime lord. She remembered that moment vividly, but not in the way Alexander Pierce or anyone else might imagine. I didn't know who he was," Cassie stammered, lifting her eyes to meet Alexander's steel-gray glare. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice a razor-sharp whisper. His composed demeanor had cracked, revealing something darker, an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I'm not lying," she shot back, her voice shaking. "It wasn't what it looks like. I was running errands for Moretti." Alexander interrupted, his tone cutting. He stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "Spare me the innocent routine, Cassandra. You don't end up in a photograph with a man like that by accident." Cassie clenched her fists. "It wasn't an accident. But I wasn't working for him, either." Alexander tilted his head, his piercing gaze seeming to strip her down to her core. "Then explain." Her pulse pounded in her ears as she took a step back, suddenly hyper-aware of how isolated they were. The heavy wooden door behind her, the vast, shadowed study, the faint sound of the wind rattling the mansion's windows. It all felt suffocating. "I had a run-in with Moretti months ago," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "I was walking Max through Central Park, and he showed up out of nowhere. He was asking people for directions, and I thought he was just another guy." Alexander arched an eyebrow. "Vincent Moretti, asking for directions. Do you think I'm a fool?" "No, but I think you need to hear the whole story," she snapped, surprising even herself. She took a shaky breath. "I didn't know who he was. Okay? He thanked me for helping him, and that was it. I walked away. I didn't even realize who he was until I saw his face on the news later that night." Alexander studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Why didn't you tell me this before? He asked, his voice quieter now but no less intense. Cassie scoffed. Tell you? The billionaire who doesn't even notice his dog Walker exists most of the time? You've barely spoken 2 words to me since I started working for you. And now you want me to explain my entire life. Alexander opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the mansion. Cassie froze. What was that? Alexander's jaw tightened. Stay here. No way, she said, already following him as he strode toward the door. He shot her a glare over his shoulder, but she didn't falter. I'm not sitting alone in a creepy mansion after hearing someone break in. Alexander didn't argue, though his clenched fists made it clear he wasn't thrilled about her decision. They moved swiftly through the dimly lit hallways, the tension between them now overshadowed by the very real danger of an intruder. When they reached the source of the noise, a shattered window in the grand living room, Cassie's stomach dropped. A man in dark clothing was crouched near the window, rifling through a desk drawer. He froze when he noticed them, then bolted for the back exit. Stop! Alexander barked, taking off after him. Wait! Cassie shouted, but Alexander was already halfway across the room. She hesitated for a split second before spotting something glinting on the floor near the broken window. A phone, dropped by the intruder during his escape. Cassie snatched it up and stuffed it into her clutch, her heart hammering in her chest. Moments later, Alexander returned, his breath ragged and his expression stormy. He got away, he growled. Cassie bit her lip, deciding not to mention the phone just yet. Do you know who it was? Not yet, he said, his tone clipped. But I will. Cassie watched as he locked the windows and double-checked the security system, the air between them thick with tension. She wanted to believe he was as in control as he appeared, but something about his movements seemed rushed, almost frantic. When they returned to the study, Alexander poured himself a glass of scotch, his hands trembling slightly as he set the bottle down. Cassie didn't miss it. This isn't about Moretti, is it? She asked cautiously. Alexander glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? The dinner, the questions, the guy breaking in. None of this is random. Alexander's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Look, I get it, she continued. You're used to being the one in control, the one with all the answers. But if you're not honest with me, I can't help you. He laughed bitterly. Help me? What makes you think I need your help? Cassie hesitated, then reached into her clutch and pulled out the phone. Because I think whoever broke in tonight was looking for this. Alexander's eyes darkened as he snatched the phone from her hand, his fingers moving quickly to unlock it. His brows furrowed as he scanned the screen, his expression growing more severe with each passing second. What is it? She asked, her stomach knotting. He didn't answer. Instead, he held up the phone and turned the screen toward her. Cassie's blood ran cold when she saw the message displayed on the screen. We know who she is. Handle it. Or we will. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The implications hung heavy in the air. Who sent that? Cassie whispered. Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. I don't know, but we're going to find out. A dangerous proposal. Alexander's demeanor shifted almost immediately. He stood straighter, his jaw set with determination. We need to move, he said abruptly. Move? Move where? To a safer location, he replied, already typing furiously on his own phone. Whoever's after you or me isn't going to stop with a warning. If they were willing to break into my home, they're not far from making this physical. Cassie felt like she'd been yanked into a spy thriller. Wait a second. You think this is about me? Don't you? He shot back. Moretti isn't exactly known for letting loose ends go. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped. The truth was, she didn't know enough to be sure. And Alexander's grave expression didn't leave much room for debate. So, what's your plan? She asked warily. He paused, studying her like a chess player contemplating his next move. You're going to stay with me until we figure this out. Cassie blinked. Stay with you? Are you out of your mind? I'm not risking your life or mine by leaving you out there unprotected, he said firmly. Cassie wanted to argue, but the urgency in his voice stopped her. As much as she hated to admit it, she felt safer with him than she would alone. But safe from what? Or who? As Alexander made arrangements for their next steps, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stepped into something far bigger than herself. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she'd survive it. The sleek black SUV navigated the dimly lit streets in tense silence. Cassie sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her fingers twisting the strap of her clutch, while Alexander drove with a single-minded focus. The message on the phone haunted her thoughts. We know who she is. Handle it. Or we will. Who were they? And what exactly did they think they knew? Alexander's face was stone cold. His jaw clenched tight as he turned sharply onto a quiet, tree-lined street. The SUV came to a stop in front of an unassuming brownstone, its windows dark. Here, Alexander said, his voice low. Cassie stared at the house, her anxiety spiking. What is this place? A safe house, he replied, already stepping out of the car. Cassie hesitated before following him, the cold night air biting at her exposed skin. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the silence amplifying her racing heartbeat. When they entered the brownstone, Alexander immediately began securing the locks and activating a series of security systems that looked more high-tech than anything Cassie had ever seen. She watched him in stunned silence. This isn't your first rodeo, is it? She finally asked. Alexander didn't look up as he armed the final lock. I don't take chances. That's not an answer. He turned to her then, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Neither is. I don't know who Moretti is. Cassie bristled. I already told you. I didn't know who he was at the time. Maybe, Alexander said, his tone as cold as his expression. But that doesn't mean you're not involved in something bigger than you realize. Cassie threw her hands up in frustration. Why don't you just say what you're thinking, Alexander? You clearly don't trust me. He stepped closer, his towering presence sending a shiver down her spine. It's not about trust, Cassandra. It's about survival. Whoever broke into my house tonight wasn't looking for me. They were looking for you. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But deep down, she knew he wasn't. I don't understand, she whispered. I'm nobody. Why would anyone come after me? Alexander's expression softened. Just barely. That's what we're going to find out. Secrets unveiled as they settled into the safe house. Alexander disappeared into a small office, leaving Cassie alone in the spacious but sparsely furnished living room. She sank into a worn leather armchair, her thoughts swirling. What had she gotten herself into? The sound of a door creaking open snapped her out of her thoughts. Alexander emerged, holding a thin manila folder. He set it down on the coffee table in front of her, his eyes locked on hers. What's this? She asked warily. Your life, he said simply. Cassie stared at him, then at the folder. Slowly, she opened it. Inside were photographs, receipts, and documents, her documents. There was her employee file from Pierce Enterprises, a copy of her lease agreement, and a photo of her and Max in Central Park. But there was more. Near the bottom of the stack was a grainy photo of her entering a diner. Across the table from her sat Vincent Moretti. Cassie's blood ran cold. That's not possible, she said, her voice trembling. I've never been in that diner. Alexander leaned forward, his expression unreadable. You're sure about that? Yes, she insisted, her voice rising. I've never even seen that place before. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then someone wants you to look guilty. Cassie's mind raced. But why? I don't have anything to do with Moretti or anyone like him. I'm just a dog walker. Alexander's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smirk. You keep saying that like it's supposed to convince me. Cassie glared at him. You know what? Screw this. You dragged me into your business dinner, and now I'm in a safe house because someone broke into your mansion looking for me. But this isn't my problem. It's yours." She stood to leave, but Alexander's next words stopped her cold. "They weren't just looking for you," he said. "They were looking for proof. Proof that I'm working with Moretti." Cassie froze, her heart pounding. "What?" Alexander stood, his imposing figure towering over her. "This isn't just about you, Cassandra. Someone's trying to frame me for laundering money through Moretti's operations." Her knees felt weak. "And they're using me to do it?" He nodded. "That's what it looks like." A new twist before Cassie could respond. The lights flickered. Alexander stiffened, his hand darting to the gun holstered at his side. "Stay here," he ordered, moving toward the front door. "No way," Cassie said, grabbing his arm. "I'm not staying alone." Alexander hesitated, then nodded curtly. Together, they crept toward the entryway, their footsteps silent on the hardwood floors. When they reached the door, Alexander peered through the peephole before yanking it open. A man stood on the stoop, his face partially obscured by the shadows. "What do you want?" Alexander demanded. The man raised his hands, his voice calm but urgent. "I need to talk to Cassandra Bennett." Cassie stepped forward, her heart racing. "Who are you?" The man's gaze flicked to her. "My name's Ryan Carter. I used to work for Vincent Moretti." Cassie's blood ran cold. "What do you want with me?" Ryan hesitated before pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "I have information about why they're after you." Alexander snatched the paper, his eyes scanning it quickly. His expression darkened as he read. "What does it say?" Cassie asked, her voice trembling. Alexander handed her the paper without a word. She unfolded it with shaky hands, her eyes widening as she read the words scrawled across the page. "She has something we need. Bring her in alive." Cassie felt the room spin. "I don't understand. What could I possibly have that they want?" Ryan stepped closer, his voice low. "Not what. Who?" Cassie stared at him, confusion and fear warring in her mind. "What are you talking about?" Ryan's gaze locked onto hers. "You're the daughter of the man who stole millions from Moretti." Cassie's breath caught in her throat. "That's not true. My father was an accountant. He died years ago." Ryan shook his head. "He faked his death, Cassandra. And now Moretti thinks you know where he is." Her knees gave out, and Alexander caught her before she hit the floor. "Why should we believe you?" Alexander demanded, his voice like ice. Ryan held his hands up defensively. "You don't have to. But if you don't get her out of here, Moretti will find her. And he won't care if she's innocent." Cassie felt the weight of Ryan's words pressing down on her chest. The life she thought she knew was unraveling before her eyes, and the truth was far more dangerous than she could have imagined. "What do we do now?" she whispered, looking up at Alexander. He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was resolute. "We fight back." The room was suffocatingly silent after Alexander's declaration. Cassie's pulse pounded in her ears as Ryan stood motionless by the door, his face lined with worry. Alexander's jaw was set like stone, his gray eyes filled with calculation. "Fight back," Cassie echoed, her voice breaking. "Against Moretti? Are you insane?" Alexander turned toward her, his presence steady but commanding. "Running won't solve anything. They've already found you once, and now they think you're the key to something or someone they want. If we don't take control of the situation, they'll come at you harder, and next time you might not get a warning." Cassie's legs felt weak, and she sank into the nearest chair. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the absurdity of her circumstances. "I don't even know where my father is," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I don't even know if this is true." Ryan stepped forward, his voice firm but cautious. "It is. Moretti doesn't make mistakes when it comes to his targets. If he thinks you can lead him to your father, he'll keep coming until he gets what he wants. Or he'll use you as leverage to force your father out of hiding." Cassie's breath hitched as panic began to set in. The man she had mourned for years, the quiet, hard-working father who had always seemed so ordinary, was now a ghost tied to the city's most dangerous criminal. "What's your angle, Ryan?" Alexander cut in, his sharp tone slicing through the tension. "Why are you helping us? Loyalty to Moretti doesn't evaporate overnight." Ryan looked directly at Alexander, his face grim. "I worked for Moretti because I didn't have a choice. He owns you once you're in. But this? Targeting her? This is beyond anything I can stomach. If I can help stop it, maybe I can make up for the damage I've done." Alexander's expression didn't soften. "How do we know this isn't a trap?" Ryan sighed. "You don't. But I can give you what you need to get ahead of him." He reached into his jacket, moving slowly, and pulled out a small USB drive. "What's on it?" Alexander demanded. "Proof," Ryan said. "Everything Moretti has on her father, including his suspected location. If you want leverage, this is your best shot." Alexander took the drive but didn't lower his guard. "And what happens to you, Ryan? You're not going back to Moretti after this, are you?" Ryan's expression darkened. "I made my bed when I turned on him, but if it keeps her alive, it's worth it." The weight of his words hung in the air. Cassie felt a strange mix of gratitude and terror. She barely knew Ryan, but now his sacrifice might be the only thing standing between her and Moretti's wrath. A glimpse of the truth. Alexander wasted no time plugging the USB drive into his laptop. The screen illuminated the room with a harsh blue glow, and Cassie leaned over to see the files Ryan had promised. Alexander's fingers moved deftly over the keyboard, opening file after file. The first few were pictures of her father, some candid, some surveillance, spanning years she thought he had been dead. "Oh my God," Cassie whispered, her voice breaking. She stared at an image of her father standing on a dock, wearing a ball cap and sunglasses. He looked older but unmistakably alive. The next file was a series of bank statements, each one linked to offshore accounts bearing her father's name. The amounts were staggering, millions of dollars spread across multiple accounts. "I don't understand," Cassie said, her voice trembling. "He was an accountant. He barely made enough to support us." Alexander's face was unreadable. He was working for someone else, someone with deep pockets and no scruples. Cassie shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No, he wouldn't do this. He wouldn't leave us and disappear like this." Ryan spoke softly. "Sometimes you don't get a choice. Sometimes you run because it's the only way to keep your family safe." Cassie looked at him, anger bubbling in her chest. "You're defending him? He let us believe he was dead." Ryan didn't flinch. "And you're alive because of it." Cassie sank back into her chair, her emotions in turmoil. She wanted to scream, cry, and demand answers, but there was no time. Alexander tapped on the keyboard again, opening the last file on the drive. It was an address. "A safe house," Alexander said. "He's been using it as a base of operations." Ryan nodded. "That's where Moretti thinks he is. But if you want to get to him before Moretti does, you'll need to move fast." Cassie stared at the screen, her stomach churning. "We're not seriously going there, are we?" Alexander turned to her, his expression resolute. "We don't have a choice." The chase. Minutes later, they were back in Alexander's SUV, speeding toward the address on the USB drive. Cassie sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "What if he's not there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we follow the next lead," Alexander replied, his focus on the road. "But if he is, we need to be prepared for anything." Ryan, who was sitting in the back seat, leaned forward. "Moretti's men will already be watching the area. You'll need a distraction to draw them out." "And you're volunteering for that job, I assume?" Alexander said. Ryan smirked faintly. "If it means keeping her alive, then yes." Cassie couldn't believe what she was hearing. A part of her wanted to tell them to stop, to turn the car around and let her disappear into obscurity. But the thought of leaving her father behind, knowing he might be in danger, made her heart ache. As they approached the safe house, the atmosphere grew tense. The house was an old, weathered building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by trees and shrouded in darkness. Alexander pulled the SUV to a stop a few blocks away. "We go in quietly," he said. "Ryan, you create the distraction. Cassie stays with me." Ryan nodded and slipped out of the car, disappearing into the shadows. Cassie's heart pounded as she followed Alexander through the dense underbrush toward the house. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. When they reached the edge of the property, they crouched behind a low stone wall. Alexander scanned the area, his sharp eyes picking out subtle movements. "They're here," he whispered. Cassie's breath caught as she spotted two figures lurking near the back entrance of the house. Before she could say anything, a loud explosion echoed through the night. Flames erupted from a car parked near the front of the property, and the figures immediately bolted toward the commotion. "That's our cue," Alexander said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the house. The safe house, the inside of the house, was eerily silent, the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. Cassie's heart raced as she followed Alexander through the dimly lit rooms, her eyes darting to every shadow. They reached a study at the back of the house, where Alexander stopped abruptly. He motioned for Cassie to stay behind him as he pushed the door open. The room was empty, but there on the desk was a single piece of paper. Alexander approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the gun at his side. He picked up the paper and read the message written in bold, black letters. "You're too late." Cassie's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" Before Alexander could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. "They're coming," he said, his voice low. "We need to move. Now." Cassie's fear spiked as they darted toward the back exit, the footsteps growing louder behind them. As they burst into the cold night air, she realized one terrifying truth. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey. The icy night air tore at Cassie's lungs as she sprinted behind Alexander, the shadowy trees of the forest enveloping them. Their breath puffed into clouds, merging with the mist of the chilling woods. Behind them, the unmistakable crunch of boots on snow grew louder. "They're gaining," Cassie hissed, her voice cracking under the weight of panic. "Keep moving," Alexander commanded, his tone sharp. His grip on her wrist tightened as he pulled her through the dense thicket. Cassie's legs burned with the effort, her adrenaline-fueled body barely able to keep pace. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to stop, to give in, but Alexander's unrelenting pull forced her forward. Ahead, the faint glow of headlights flickered through the trees. The SUV. "Ryan better be there," Alexander growled under his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the firearm holstered under his jacket. As they neared the vehicle, a figure emerged from the shadows. For one terrifying moment, Cassie thought it was one of Moretti's men. But then Ryan stepped into the light, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "I stalled them as long as I could," Ryan panted, gesturing frantically toward the SUV. "Go! Get in the car!" Alexander barked, shoving Cassie toward the passenger side. She threw herself into the seat as Alexander and Ryan leapt into action. The engine roared to life, the tires skidding briefly before catching traction on the icy road. Cassie's pulse hammered as she glanced out the rear window. Shadows darted through the trees behind them, illuminated by flashlights and the occasional muzzle flash. The men were armed and relentless. "Do they ever give up?" she gasped, clutching the door handle for dear life. "Not when they smell blood," Ryan muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of the driver's seat. Alexander's expression was cold and calculated as he steered the vehicle down the winding forest road. "Let them come. We'll be ready." A plan born of desperation. By the time they reached the edge of the city, the pursuing vehicles had fallen back, their drivers likely regrouping for a more organized assault. Cassie slumped in her seat, every muscle in her body trembling with exhaustion. "We need to get off the grid," Ryan said. "If Moretti's men track us into the city, it's over." Alexander didn't respond immediately. He pulled into the underground parking garage of a nondescript building, cutting the engine and plunging them into darkness. I have one last option, he said finally, his voice grim. Cassie turned to him, her heart sinking at the weight in his tone. What option? Alexander reached into the glove compartment, retrieving another phone, a burner, judging by its generic design. He dialed a number, his jaw clenching as he waited for the call to connect. It's me, he said when someone answered. His voice was low, almost reluctant. I need a favor. Cassie couldn't hear the response, but Alexander's expression grew darker with each passing second. He ended the call abruptly, stuffing the phone into his pocket. We're going to meet someone, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Ryan stiffened. Who? An old associate, Alexander replied, his hesitation obvious. He's not someone I trust, but he owes me. If anyone can help us out of this mess, it's him. Cassie's stomach churned. And what happens if he decides to turn on you instead? Alexander met her gaze, his gray eyes unyielding. Then we improvise. The meeting place was a crumbling warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where bad things happen to desperate people. Cassie couldn't shake the sense of impending doom as they stepped inside, the stale scent of mildew and oil filling her nostrils. A single overhead light illuminated the center of the cavernous space, where a man waited. He was tall and wiry, with a scar running down one side of his face. His cold smile sent a chill down Cassie's spine. Pierce, the man drawled, his voice smooth but dangerous. You're braver than I remember, coming here with a target on your back. Cut the small talk, Calder, Alexander said, stepping forward. I need safe passage out of the city for her. He nodded toward Cassie. Calder's gaze slid to Cassie, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. Ah, so this is the infamous girl causing all the trouble. What's so special about her? She's none of your concern, Alexander said sharply. Calder chuckled, holding up his hands. Relax, old friend. I don't care what mess you've gotten yourself into, but favors aren't free. Alexander's jaw tightened. Name your price. Calder's smile widened, and Cassie's stomach dropped. Moretti's been on my tail for months. Give me the files you have on him, the ones your boy Ryan's been hiding, and I'll get you out clean. Ryan stiffened. You can't be serious. Those files are the only leverage we have. I'm not asking, Calder said, his tone hardening. If you want my help, that's the deal. Cassie looked between them, her mind racing. If they handed over the files, they'd lose any advantage they had against Moretti. But without Calder's help, they wouldn't survive the night. It's your call, Calder said, his smile never wavering. But you don't have much time. The double-cross Alexander hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching into his coat and pulling out a USB drive. Fine, he said, his voice cold. You win. He handed the drive to Calder, who grinned like a predator. Pleasure doing business, Calder said, slipping the drive into his pocket. But as he turned to leave, the air in the warehouse shifted. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the space, and Cassie's blood ran cold. Moretti's men emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn. You didn't think Calder would let you off that easy, did you? One of them sneered. Cassie's heart sank as Calder stepped aside, his grin widening. Sorry, Pierce. Favors only go so far. Get behind me, Alexander growled, pulling Cassie back as he drew his gun. The next moments were a blur of chaos. Shots rang out, and Cassie dropped to the ground, her hands covering her head as bullets ricocheted off the walls. Ryan and Alexander returned fire, their movements sharp and precise, but they were outnumbered. In the chaos, Cassie spotted Calder slipping toward an exit, the USB drive clutched in his hand. Something inside her snapped. Without thinking, she darted after him. Cassie! Alexander shouted, but she didn't stop. Calder turned just as she reached him, his eyes widening in surprise. What are you? Cassie didn't let him finish. She grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the floor and swung it with all her might. The impact sent Calder sprawling, the USB drive skittering across the ground. Cassie snatched it up, her chest heaving. "You're making a mistake," Calder snarled, struggling to his feet. "No," she said, her voice steady. "You did." The final blow back in the main room, Alexander and Ryan had managed to push Moretti's men into retreat, but the cost was clear. Ryan was slumped against a wall, bleeding from a gunshot wound to his leg. Alexander's eyes widened when he saw Cassie running toward him, the USB drive in hand. "Let's go," she shouted, helping Ryan to his feet. The three of them limped out of the warehouse and into the waiting SUV, the sound of sirens in the distance signaling the approaching police. As they sped away, Cassie clutched the USB drive tightly, her resolve hardening. Moretti wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. But now neither was she. It was time to stop running. It was time to fight.